The quiet ones are always the most dangerous. That was what Dr. Marcus Ashford should have noticed on Katie Rodriguez's first night at Seattle General, but he didn't. He was too busy deciding who belonged in his emergency department and who was simply taking up space. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electronic drone above the scuffed linoleum as Katie moved through the trauma bay at 11:13 p.m., her movements economical, precise, the kind of efficiency that came from doing something 1,000 times before. She had a limp. A small one, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it, which Ashford wasn't. He was watching the new residents fumble through their first shift, watching the attending in the trauma wing forget to order a CBC, watching the world work below his standards. Katie Rodriguez was simply background noise. The night shift at Seattle General ran on a different frequency than the day. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder in the darkness, and the ER transformed into something quieter, more intimate. Fewer visitors. Fewer families. Just the staff and the broken bodies that arrived through the ambulance bay in their steady stream. Katie had been there for 6 weeks now. 6 weeks of arriving 30 minutes early to review the unit census. 6 weeks of not correcting anyone when they got her name wrong. 6 weeks of keeping her head down. The limp was the only thing people saw, and the limp told them a story that wasn't quite true. Car accident, maybe. Or some old sports injury. Nobody asked. Nobody cared to know that the limp came from a Corolla-sized chunk of shrapnel that had torn through her left femur on a dusty road outside Tikrit in 2015, when she was Major Catherine Rodriguez, not Katie the quiet night shift nurse with hands that moved like they were remembering something important. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, the fabric worn soft from 100 washings, and that's when her fingers found it. The faded patch. She always did this before shift, found the small square of threadbare fabric sewn deep inside her jacket lining, pressed it against her palm for exactly 3 seconds, then let go. It was smaller than a postage stamp, the green of the fabric bleached almost white in places, with the crossed arrows of the 5th Special Forces Group barely visible anymore. Tikrit. 3rd tour. The medic who didn't make it out. The 12 wounded soldiers she'd extracted under fire before her leg shattered and her career ended and everything became about learning how to walk again, how to be invisible, how to be nobody. She closed her eyes. 3 seconds. Then she hung her jacket in the locker and locked it. The patch stayed exactly where it had been for 9 years, hidden against her heart, a reminder that some battles you win by simply refusing to surrender who you are. The break room was nearly empty when she got there. 2 nurses she'd never spoken to exchanged a look and suddenly remembered errands. That was always how it went. The hierarchy at Seattle General was written in the way people moved through space, the way they angled their bodies, the small adjustments that meant either you belonged or you were tolerated. Katie had learned the military version of this same language long ago. She knew the exact posture that made you invisible. Slightly hunched shoulders. Eyes down during conversations. Questions phrased as apologies. Never, and this was critical, never let them see you thinking you were better than them. The experienced night nurses had already decided something about her. Maybe it was the way she moved. Maybe it was the limp. Maybe it was just the simple fact that she was new and therefore a threat to their territory. Katie made coffee. Black. No sugar. The kind that tasted like discipline. She drank it standing up, then checked the unit census. 12 beds. 8 occupied. 3 scheduled admissions before midnight. 1 patient in Bay 4 with a cardiac history and a complaint of chest pressure that had started 2 hours ago. Katie scanned the chart and stopped. The EKG was wrong. Or rather, it looked right at first glance, normal sinus rhythm, nothing alarming, but there was something underneath the normal. A subtle shift in the ST segment that most people would miss, that most systems would miss. It was the kind of thing you learned to see when you'd spent 18 months running a forward surgical team in Helmand Province, when you learned to read the small signs that meant the next 10 minutes mattered more than the next 10 years. She pulled the raw EKG data on the computer and zoomed in. There. Millimeter of elevation in the inferior leads. Early STEMI. The patient needed imaging now. Not in 10 minutes. Not after the doctor finished his rounds. Now. The intercom crackled overhead, a sound like someone breathing static. Katie moved toward the trauma bay just as Dr. Ashford arrived for shift change. He wore a tailored white coat that cost more than Katie's entire monthly rent, and his stethoscope hung around his neck like a piece of jewelry rather than a tool. His watch was a $14,000 Submariner, she noticed, because you notice things when you'd learn to read situations the way soldiers read terrain. Everything about Ashford announced his position. The way the other doctors straightened when he arrived. The way the residents moved faster. The way the nurses adjusted themselves, became smaller, more deferential. He was the apex predator in this space, and he moved through it like he owned the air he breathed. Katie caught him at the chart rack with her patient's EKG printed in her hand. She kept her voice soft, deferential, the way she'd practiced. Dr. Ashford? Bed 4 is showing early street elevation. Inferior leads. He's having chest pressure for 2 hours. She offered the EKG. She didn't push. She didn't insist. She was simply informing him of a fact, the way a junior officer informs a commanding officer of the situation on the ground. This was stage 1 of his power demonstration, though she didn't know that yet. He glanced at the EKG, not really looked, just glanced, and handed it back without taking it. His hands were smooth. Surgeon's hands, technically, though Katie had noticed he rarely actually operated. He managed. He directed. He ordered. He did not put his own hands inside people. New protocol is observation for suspected STEMI, Ashford said. His voice carried the particular weight of a man who had never been contradicted. We image after stabilization, not before. Katie accepted the EKG. The current STEMI protocols recommend imaging within 45 minutes of symptom onset. The moment the words left her mouth, she knew she'd made an error. Not a professional error, the protocol was correct, the medicine was right, the patient's outcome would be better if they image now. But she'd made a social error, and in hierarchies like Seattle General's, social errors were far more dangerous than medical ones. Ashford's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the space between them. His eyes moved across her with the kind of assessment that suggested he was seeing her for the first time, and what he saw was a threat. I'll manage the STEMI protocol, Rodriguez. The way he said her name made it clear he'd learned it without ever really listening to it. You manage the vitals. We'll image when I decide it's time. Katie's jaw tightened. She felt the familiar pressure in her chest, the sensation of holding something back, the same feeling she'd had standing in hospitals in Kandahar when she had to watch people die because the rules said to wait. She was a major. She had commanded soldiers. She had made decisions in the dark that saved lives. And now she was standing in a Houston emergency department at 11:57 p.m. being told to follow orders that would statistically cost her patient 6 minutes of critical time. But her face remained flat. Her voice remained soft. Of course, doctor. He nodded, satisfied with her submission, and moved on to the next patient. Katie returned to bed 4 and placed her hand on the patient's shoulder. He was a man in his 60s, grey at the temples, the kind of face that suggested a life of hard decisions. We're going to take good care of you, she said quietly. I'm going to get your vitals every 15 minutes. My chest really hurts, the man said. I know. She started and 4 with one smooth motion, 14-gauge catheter, in on the first try, the kind of insertion that made the junior techs watch in stunned silence because it wasn't supposed to be that clean, that fast. I'm going to give you something for the pain. The vital signs monitor beeped its rhythm. Oxygen saturation 98%. Heart rate 89. Blood pressure 142/88. Everything normal on the surface. Everything dangerous underneath. Katie finished her rounds and stepped away, checking her watch. 12:04 a.m. The patient had chest pain since 10 p.m. They were already 4 minutes behind. She wrote the time in her notes anyway. Everything documented. Everything by the book. Everything correct, even if nobody was listening. The night settled into its rhythm. The trauma bay filled with the small sounds of healing, ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath, the heart monitors beeped their patient songs, the fluorescent lights continued their constant electronic hum. Katie moved through the space with the kind of invisibility that comes from perfect compliance and minimal presence. She checked the patient in bed for every 15 minutes. She charted everything. She said nothing. At 1:24 a.m., Ashford ordered imaging. The patient was already 90 minutes into his STEMI window. They found a 92% occlusion in the right coronary artery. He would need intervention. Katie stood at the nurse's station, watching the cardiology resident move with the kind of urgency that meant they were behind schedule, and she felt the familiar weight of something unspoken. This was the job now. Watch. Document. Comply. Disappear. The veteran nurses at Seattle General had figured it out fast enough. They'd built their strategies around avoiding Ashford's attention. Stay invisible. Don't contradict. Don't suggest. Don't think you know better. Katie had learned a similar strategy in the army, but it had been for different reasons then. She'd learned it because she was commanding soldiers and the cost of being wrong was measured in funerals. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she understood exactly why Ashford had ordered observation instead of imaging. It wasn't stupidity. It wasn't that he didn't know the protocols. It was something far more dangerous. It was the absolute certainty of a man who had never been questioned, who had built an entire identity around the assumption that his judgment was superior to everyone else's, including the evidence. And she had just spent 6 weeks learning that Seattle General had 1,000 different ways of protecting men like that. She poured another cup of coffee. Black. No sugar. And at 2:15 a.m., she made a note in her personal file that she'd reviewed the STEMI protocol with a consulting cardiologist, just in case she ever needed to prove that she'd known better. Just in case. The way soldiers keep insurance policies they hope they'll never need to use. Room 302 smelled like antiseptic and fear. The patient, a 60-year-old man with grey at his temples and panic in his eyes, clutched his chest while his wife gripped the bedrail and their adult son stood rigid in the corner, watching everything, trusting no one. Katie had been monitoring him for 90 minutes, watching the pattern. The chest pain wasn't radiating anxiety like Dr. Ashford's initial assessment suggested. It was something else. Something that lived in the numbers on the monitor. She pulled up the 12-lead EKG on the tablet. ST elevation. Clear as a printed confession in the anterior leads. STEMI protocol, updated just last month, called for emergent cardiac imaging. No delay. No consultation. The science was absolute. Katie approached Dr. Ashford as he reviewed the chart at the nurse's station, her voice respectful, careful, the way she had learned to make herself small enough not to threaten men in white coats. Dr. Ashford, I'm seeing ST elevation on the anterior wall. The latest STEMI guidelines recommend immediate imaging. Should we be calling cardiology? Dr. Ashford didn't look up from the chart. His laugh came soft and clinical, the sound of someone amused by a child asking why the sky was blue. Nurse Rodriguez, your limited experience is showing. He finally glanced at her, his eyes carrying the weight of a man certain of his superiority. This patient has a documented history of anxiety. We don't waste cardiologists' time because a night nurse with 6 months here gets nervous. Back in room 302, the patient's wife had heard. Her face creased with confusion and worry, the specific worry that comes from not knowing whose side to trust. The son's jaw tightened. Katie stood in the doorway, and the family watched her, waiting for validation or contradiction, a signal about whether they should be afraid. Dr. Ashford strolled in behind her, his presence commanding the small space like a man who had never questioned his right to occupy it. He smiled warmly at the wife and son, a practiced gesture, all teeth and certainty. Your father is fine. Sometimes our newer staff see zebras when they hear hoofbeats. Classic medical student error. He turned to Katie, and his voice dropped to something sharp-edged. Protocol is MY call, Nightingale. Chart the vitals and let the doctors practice medicine. Katie's jaw tightened. Just once. One visible response. Then she took a measured breath and turned back to her monitor, her hands moving to document what he had ordered, what protocol demanded, what her training screamed was wrong. She said nothing. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She had spent 18 years learning when not to speak. The break room the next day was a masterclass in choreographed absence. Katie sat at the corner table with her lunch, a sandwich she wouldn't finish and a bottle of water that sweated condensation onto the formica. Within 30 seconds, Nurse Chen suddenly remembered she needed to check supply stock in the back. Nurse Patel glanced at her phone, whispered about an urgent hallway consultation. The room emptied like water down a drain, leaving Katie alone with the hum of the vending machine and the smell of stale coffee that no one had bothered to clean from the pot. She took one bite of her sandwich. Set it down. Didn't finish. By Thursday morning, the humiliation had been formalized. The unit board near the time clock, the one every staff member checked when clocking in and out, displayed a new entry under disciplinary actions, Rodriguez, K, insubordination and protocol deviation, failure to respect physician authority, formal warning issued. Katie clocked out that morning and saw the write-up before she reached the exit. 2-day shift nurses clustered around it, voices dropping to whispers when she approached. One of them, Jenny from Pediatrics, looked away. The other, Marcus from Triage, pretended to study his phone with sudden intensity. The message was clear. The hierarchy had spoken. Katie was marked. Later that shift, by the med cart near the supply closet, Dr. Ashford cornered her. His voice dropped low, pitched for her ears only, the careful discretion of a predator who understands the value of private humiliation. You seem to think your opinion matters here. It doesn't. This is MYER. You're a replaceable night nurse with a limp who should be grateful she has a job at all. One tear escaped. Just one. It traced her cheek like a tributary finding its path. Katie wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without flinching, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Her voice emerged steady and quiet, carrying a precision that made the words land like a scalpel. Sir, patients don't care about our egos when they're coding. His face flushed red. Real red. The color of a man suddenly uncertain about his dominance. He opened his mouth, closed it, then, get back to work, Nightingale. She did. Friday night arrived with the weight of an inevitable collision. Katie had been working night shift for 11 days straight, her body running on coffee and the kind of purpose that doesn't require sleep. The radio crackled at 2,147 hours with a call that changed the entire landscape of her night: mass casualty motor vehicle collision on Interstate 10, multiple traumas inbound, ETA for minutes. Katie moved into action with the automatic efficiency of muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing school. She prepped trauma bays 1 through 4, checking supplies, confirming airway equipment, laying out the crystalloid lines and pressure infusers. Around her, the ER transformed. Day shift nurses staying late to help. Residents called in early. The controlled chaos of a facility preparing for the worst kind of mathematics: more patients than capacity, more injuries than solutions. The first ambulance screamed through the bay doors at 2,151 hours. Then the second. Then a third pulled in sideways, its paramedics shouting vitals that painted a picture of devastation: 54-year-old male, penetrating thoracic trauma from debris, sucking chest wound left anterior, BP 92/58, falling, SATS 84, breathing compromised. The gurney crashed through the ER doors and Katie saw him clearly for the first time. A man in his 50s, his chest slick with blood that looked black under the fluorescent lights, breath coming in wet, rattling gasps like something was pulling the air from his lungs through a puncture wound. Combat boots visible beneath the blanket. Hands that looked like they had held heavy things for a living. The paramedic rattled off additional context: metal debris from the collision, sharp edge, went in and didn't come out, pressures dropping, SATS continuing to fall. Katie moved toward the trauma bay, her hands already reaching for the equipment she would need, already running the algorithm of what came next. But Dr. Ashford stepped in front of her, his presence blocking her path like a door slamming shut. Trauma surgery is 10 minutes out. We stabilize and wait. No one touches him until Dr. Morrison arrives. Katie glanced at the patient. His lips were turning blue. His chest moved asymmetrically, one side rising, the other not. The clinical picture assembled itself in her mind like a puzzle clicking into shape: tension, pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart, pressure building with each breath, his body suffocating from the inside out. Sir, he won't last 10 minutes. We need to decompress the chest, needle at the second intercostal space, we need to. Did I ask for your opinion, Nightingale? Dr. Ashford's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Everyone stop. We wait for the specialist. The room froze. Every eye turned toward the attending physician. Nurses exchanged glances, the kind of glances that carry entire conversations. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped to 79% on the monitor. Then 76. The rhythm was deteriorating. His heart was beginning to fail. Katie watched the numbers fall. Watched the patient's face turn the color of something already dying. Watched Dr. Ashford stand with his arms crossed, absolutely certain of his authority, absolutely wrong about the science. Something shifted in her eyes. A door opening in a hallway she thought had closed years ago. A decision made in the space between heartbeats. The quiet night shift nurse straightened. Her shoulders rolled back. When she spoke, her voice dropped an octave, dropping further, dropping into a register that came from somewhere beneath the scrubs and the careful deference and the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining. Step aside, doctor. Now. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator breathing for a patient 3 bays over. The monitors beeped their escalating alarm. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant frequency. But every person in that emergency department heard the command in her voice, the kind of authority that comes from having already survived the worst. The radio crackled at 2,147 hours. Dispatch voice, clipped an urgent, mass casualty collision, I-10 eastbound near the Bellaria exit. Multiple vehicles, at least 6 reported. First ambulance ETA for minutes. Second and third units following. All trauma personnel stand by. The emergency department shifted. Not panic, precision. The choreography of Seattle General's trauma response kicked into motion like a rehearsed film, every person moving to their station. Nurses grabbed trauma shears. Respiratory therapists positioned intubation trays. The blood bank received the standing order without being asked. Katie moved through the controlled urgency with her hands already knowing what to do. She pulled the crash cart to Trauma Bay 1, checking the defibrillator pads, the medication tray, the 14-gauge angiocath needles laid out in ascending order. Her fingers found the equipment by muscle memory, not thought. This part, the preparation, was something her hands had done before in places that didn't appear on any resume. Dr. Ashford stood at the nurse's station, hands clasped behind his back, his tailored white coat pristine as always. He watched the activity with the expression of a conductor observing an orchestra. When Katie passed him moving toward Trauma Bay 2, his voice stopped her. Rodriguez. Stand down. Not a request. A command filtered through the certainty of institutional power. She turned. Met his eyes. Said nothing. The trauma surgeon is en route from his home. ETA 20 minutes. We wait for him. Protocol. His jaw moved slightly, a man accustomed to obedience. You understand? We observe. We stabilize. We do not initiate advanced interventions without proper attending supervision. Katie nodded once. The gesture cost her nothing. She understood exactly what he was saying, and exactly what he wasn't trained to see about her silence. It wasn't agreement. It was the pause of a sniper before the trigger break. The first ambulance's siren grew louder, then stopped. The bay doors opened. The paramedic team moved with controlled speed, their voices overlapping in the specific language of emergency medicine, vitals being called out, mechanism of injury, treatment already started in the field. And then the stretcher came through. An older man, silver-haired, his uniform visible beneath the oxygen mask and field bandages. A colonel's insignia on what remained of his sleeve. His chest, one side of it, had a wound that shouldn't exist outside of a surgery suite. A sucking chest wound. The kind where air moved in and out of the pleural cavity with every breath, each intake collapsing the lung further, building pressure that would eventually stop his heart. The paramedic calling it out, 58-year-old male, multi-vehicle collision, ejected from vehicle, chest trauma with what appears to be pneumothorax on the left side. O2 sat dropped to 74 en route, we've got him bagged at 15 litres, 2 large bore 4s running normal saline, but we're losing ground. BP 82 over 56 and falling. He's been down about 18 minutes from time of collision. The stretcher rolled into Trauma Bay 1. Nurses converged, Chen, Patel, Morrison from the afternoon shift who'd stayed late. They moved with practiced synchronization, transferring the patient to the hospital stretcher, maintaining continuity of the field lines, getting him hooked to the monitor. The heart rhythm displayed, tachycardic, compensation, the electrical system working frantically to keep a body alive that was drowning in its own chest cavity. The wet sucking sound. That was the sound Katie heard first. Not metaphorical. Actual. The sound of air moving through a wound it shouldn't move through, the body's own breath becoming its enemy. Dr. Ashford stood at the entrance to the bay, his hands in his pockets now, his expression clinical and distant. Observing. Not participating. Continue supportive care, he said to no one in particular. Trauma surgeon is 19 minutes out. We maintain current interventions until he arrives. Katie watched the colonel's oxygen saturation drop, 74, 71, 68. His systolic pressure falling in tandem. The heart monitor's beep accelerating into almost a single tone, one alarm chasing another. His eyes were open, aware, the kind of awareness that came from knowing what dying felt like. The paramedic had set the patient's gear bag on the floor beside the trauma bay entrance, a patrol pack, the kind soldiers carried, dust from the roadway still on its corners. Military-issued, worn canvas, the fabric faded to the color of old photographs. Katie's eyes caught it for a half-second. Then she was moving. Not toward Dr. Ashford. Not toward asking permission. She moved toward the gear bag, her hands already reaching. The limp that usually defined her movement, the aftermath of an IED blast that had shattered her femur and ankle, disappeared completely. Adrenaline did that. Adrenaline and something deeper, something that had been trained into her bones in a place called Tikrit where the only thing between survival and a body bag was the speed of your hands. She tore open the pack. Field supplies, a water bottle, an MRE packet. She ripped the MRE open with her teeth, shredding the plastic, extracting the meal component wrapper. Thick plastic. Waterproof. Exactly what an improvised one-way valve needed to be. I need occlusive dressing. Chest tube tray. Suction. Now. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't plead. It was the voice of someone used to giving orders that kept people alive, and every single person in that trauma bay responded like their next breath depended on it. She tore the MRE wrapper into a square roughly 6 inches across. Her hands positioned it over the sucking wound, 3 sides taped down with trauma tape from Chen's outstretched hands. One side left loose, the seal that would let air escape but not enter. The wet sucking sound stopped. The plastic fluttered once with each exhale, a one-way valve fashioned from something designed to keep soldiers fed in the field now keeping one alive. Bag him. 15 liters. Katie's hands were already moving to the next problem. Get me respiratory on the phone. I need a chest tube tray open now. Nurse Patel was reaching for the phone, his hand shaking slightly but his movements precise. Nurse Chen had the chest tube set up already ready, passing it to Katie without being asked. The muscle memory took over completely now. Katie's fingers palpated the Colonel's trachea, feeling the deviation, tracheal shift to the right, confirming what the vital signs had been screaming. Tension pneumothorax. The air accumulating in the pleural space on the left was compressing not just the lung but the heart itself, pushing it away from center, strangling it. Her hands prepped the decompression site. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The 14-gauge needle went in with a practiced angle, smooth, no hesitation. The hiss of air escaping. That particular sound, the sound of pressure releasing, of a body getting a second chance. The monitor's rhythm smoothed. The oxygen saturation climbed, 78, 82, 87, 91. The tachycardia began to slow, the heart rate dropping from 140 to 120 as the pressure released. "Get me 2 units of type O on standby," Katie said. "We need a chest X-ray before we move him. Tell respiratory I'm ready for intubation if his mental status changes, but right now he's maintaining airway." The Colonel's eyes found hers. Not words, just the look of someone who recognized something in her that went beyond nursing credentials. The look of someone who'd seen people work under impossible pressure and knew the difference between training and what lived beneath it. His daughter burst through the trauma bay doors, mid-30s, short dark hair, her eyes wild, her voice reaching for control and losing, "That's my father." "Is he? Oh God, is he?" Katie didn't look up from her work, her hands adjusting before drip rate, securing the needle decompression site with sterile dressing. Step back. "He's critical but we're working. He's stable enough for now." The daughter moved back, her hands pressed against her mouth, watching the small woman in scrubs who'd just stopped her father's death. Dr. Ashford stood motionless at the bay entrance, his face the color of old parchment. His hands had come out of his pockets. He was staring at Katie with an expression she couldn't quite parse, something between shock and something darker. Realization, maybe. The understanding that whatever he'd calculated about her competence, about her place in his hierarchy, had been catastrophically wrong. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stepped into the hallway. Through the window, Katie could see him, his back turned, the phone to his ear, his expression cold and calculating. His mouth moving, words she couldn't hear. His free hand gesturing with the specific emphasis of someone making a call that mattered. Someone calling in favors. Someone activating whatever leverage he'd built into his network of allies on the medical board. Katie turned back to the Colonel, her focus complete, her hand steady as a surgical laser. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. 82 beats per minute. Normal sinus rhythm. The oxygen saturation holding at 94. The blood pressure climbing back toward something sustainable, 1/62. Stable. Not saved. Not yet. But alive. Conscious. A man with silver hair and a colonel's insignia who'd looked at her for 1/2 second and seen something that everyone else in this hospital had missed. But that wasn't the worst part. Not the phone call Dr. Ashford was making. Not the beginning of whatever response he was orchestrating in that hallway. The worst part was the question forming in the Colonel's daughter's eyes as she watched Katie work, the way she stared at her hands, at her posture, at the absolute certainty of her movements. The way recognition seemed to be building in her expression, piece by piece, like someone slowly understanding a photograph they'd only half looked at before. The needle went in clean. O2 sat climbing. 75. 82. 88. Stable. Katie's hands didn't shake as she secured the improvised chest seal, the MRE packet's foil wrapper pressed against the sucking wound with surgical precision, her fingers moving like they'd performed this exact procedure 1,000 times instead of just the once, in a convoy outside Fallujah, except this time there was proper equipment waiting and a surgical suite 20 feet down the hall instead of a medevac bird screaming overhead with rotor wash shredding everything visible. The Colonel's breathing steadied. His color shifted from the gray of exsanguination to something approaching human again, and Katie didn't look at his daughter watching her hands anymore. She couldn't afford to. Muscle memory had overridden 20 months of civilian invisibility, and now every nurse in the trauma bay could feel the shift in the room, the absolute certainty radiating from someone who had stopped asking permission and started giving orders. Typo negative. 2 units, push protocol. Her voice dropped an octave, cut across the chaos like a command from someone accustomed to being obeyed under fire. Not a request. Not a suggestion. Nurse Chen moved without hesitation. The blood was already hanging. The rapid infuser hummed as it pressurized the line, warm blood pushing into the Colonel's femoral axis at rates that would have made a standard for nurse's hands shake. Katie's didn't shake. Her limp vanished as adrenaline overrode 3 years of chronic pain, her left leg responding to muscle memory that transcended conscious thought, that belonged to a woman in desert camouflage moving through a marketplace in Tikrit with a wounded soldier slung across her shoulders. Left anterior thoracotomy kit. Now. No inflection. No urgency in her voice because urgency was for people who weren't certain. Katie was certain. The crash cart's drawers slid open. Scalpels, retractors, hemostats, and a Reboa balloon catheter, resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, used when bleeding couldn't stop any other way. Dr. Ashford stood frozen in the corner, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to remember how to form words, watching a night shift nurse orchestrate a trauma response that should have been his domain, except he wasn't orchestrating anything. He was drowning in the knowledge that he'd failed, and this woman who'd questioned his diagnostic judgment, who he'd written up for insubordination, who he'd isolated from every colleague in the department, was doing his job better than he ever had. Katie didn't glance at him. She was already moving the Colonel's clothes away from his ribs, already assessing the wound trajectory, already making the calculations that lived in the muscle and bone of someone who'd extracted 12 wounded soldiers from active fire in a single afternoon. Blood loss estimation, she said to no one in particular, but Nurse Chen answered immediately. Approximately 2 liters visible. Probable intrathoracic bleeding based on wound depth. Katie nodded once. The seal was holding. The O2 sat was climbing now, 91, 94, 97. The Colonel's blood pressure had stopped its free fall. Systolic was rising. Not good yet, but no longer catastrophic. Not yet in the space where decisions meant choosing which parts of him to save first. Get me OR status. I want him prepped and open within 10 minutes. It wasn't a request. It was a command from someone who had the authority because she'd just saved a life that the attending physician had decided could wait. The room moved like water around her, like every person in that trauma bay suddenly understood that the invisible night shift nurse who'd been sitting alone in break rooms and accepting write-ups without argument had been someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Someone who'd been hiding not just her past but her actual competence, letting them all believe she was smaller than she was. The Colonel's hand moved, trembling, and Katie paused just long enough to meet his eyes. Recognition flickered there, the kind that military people carry like a secret, the way one warrior knows another across any distance, any uniform, any amount of time. His mouth moved, shaping a single word that only came out as a breath, Tikrit. Katie didn't answer. She couldn't afford to. The trauma surgeon had been called overhead. Dr. Morrison was 3 minutes out, and there was work to do before he arrived, assessments to make, preparations that couldn't wait for hierarchy or protocol or the careful dance of respecting the chain of command. That dance had ended the moment she'd torn open that MRE packet. The chest seal held firm. The transfusion protocol was running at maximum rate, 2 units of O2 negative flowing into the Colonel's depleted veins like his body was a well that had finally been given permission to be filled. Katie's hands moved from the wound to the foreaxis, checking the line security, adjusting the flow, her fingers steady as a surgical laser as she worked through the checklist that didn't exist in any hospital protocol book because it belonged to a different kind of training, the kind that came from having held lives together in the dirt between Baghdad and the mountains, from having made split-second decisions when the cost of hesitation was measured in the seconds until somebody bled out. The elevator doors opened and Dr. Marcus Morrison walked through, tall, shoulders that moved like he was carrying weight that had nothing to do with his jacket, eyes that assessed trauma scenes the way other people read menus. He was trauma chief, decorated enough that even Dr. Ashford moved aside when Morrison entered a room, and his gaze swept the scene once before settling on Katie. Status, he said, but it wasn't a question for her. It was more like confirmation that she was about to tell him something he needed to know. Sucking chest wound, left anterior thorax. Sealed at field, now stabilized. 2 liters PRBC's running protocol. Blood pressure recovering. O2 sat 97. Green Beret Colonel, combat-related trauma. Katie's voice was steady, professional, stripped of any hint of the civilian nurse who'd apologized for questioning diagnostic judgment 2 days ago. Morrison moved to the wound, his hands careful as he examined Katie's improvised work. The sterile field, the seal's placement, the way the MRE foil had been pressed to stop the suction without compromising airway. He studied it for exactly 4 seconds, then looked up at Katie. Clean field procedure. Where'd you learn this? His voice carried the kind of respect that came from one professional recognizing another. Trauma protocols, sir. She didn't blink. She didn't elaborate. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that there was more to that answer than she could say in front of the people watching them, but trusting anyway. That was what real competence generated, trust that transcended explanation. He turned to the assembled staff, his voice cutting like a blade. This intervention saved his life. Another 5 minutes without this seal, we wouldn't be having this conversation. He looked back at Katie. Let's get him to OR. I want you in the gallery. It wasn't a request. It was an order from someone with actual authority, the kind that came from knowing what you were doing and never needing to prove it twice. The stretcher was moving before Morrison finished speaking. The colonel's eyes found Katie's one more time as they wheeled him toward the elevator, and in that moment, suspended in the fluorescent light of the emergency department, something shifted. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining seemed to pulse against her ribs like a second heartbeat, and Katie felt the weight of 20 months of invisibility beginning to crack. The elevator doors closed. The trauma was moving to ICU now, to the surgical suite where Dr. Morrison would open the colonel's chest and repair whatever internal damage the bullet had carved through muscle and bone. The colonel would survive. Katie's intervention had guaranteed it, and every person in the emergency department understood now that they had been watching someone who shouldn't exist, a nurse whose competence transcended anything a protocol manual could teach, whose hands carried knowledge that no civilian hospital could have given her. Dr. Ashford stood motionless in the corner, his face the color of old linoleum, watching his carefully constructed authority collapse like wet tissue. His hand moved toward his phone, fingers trembling, and Katie knew with absolute certainty what he was about to do. He was going to call administration. He was going to file a complaint. He was going to activate every institutional weapon he possessed because she had just exposed him, not as incompetent, exactly, but as mediocre, as someone who froze when competence was actually demanded. She watched him step into the break room, pull out his phone, dial with the precision of someone making a calculated move in a game he believed he was still winning. Katie didn't stop him. She didn't need to. Everything that happened next would move like a predetermined sequence, a cascade of consequences that had started the moment she'd torn open that MRE packet and revealed what she'd been hiding. Dr. Ashford would make his calls. Administration would begin their review. Her reassignments would start by Friday, her supporting staff scattered across other shifts, her access to supply rooms suddenly restricted pending inventory audits that would take months. But for now, in the space between her last breath in the trauma bay and the moment security would be called to her office on Monday morning, Katie allowed herself something that looked almost like a smile. The colonel's hand had trembled as he'd whispered her call sign. His daughter had started to understand. And in 20 minutes, when the trauma surgeon was already operating and the patient was already secured in the ICU, when the medical record would show that an improvised field procedure had saved a life that would have been lost to institutional protocol, by then, everything would have changed. She didn't know it yet. She didn't know about the black SUVs pulling up to Seattle General's entrance in exactly 3 hours, about the military personnel moving through the corridors with the kind of calm authority that only came from being accustomed to power they didn't need to announce. She didn't know that the photo of her medic, waiting in her apartment in its frame, was about to be joined by recognition that she'd stopped believing was possible. For now, she just stood in the empty trauma bay, watching the blood-soaked gauze being disposed of, listening to the monitors slowly returning to their resting rhythms, and felt the unit patch against her heart like a secret finally about to be told. The monitors returned to their resting rhythm. The blood pooled on the trauma bay floor reflected the fluorescent lights like spilled mercury. Katie's hands were steady as surgical steel as she peeled off the latex gloves, watching the colonel's chest rise and fall with the mechanical precision of a ventilator doing the work of lungs that had nearly stopped working forever. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply moved toward the supply room, head down, aware of every eye in the trauma bay tracking her movements like she was something dangerous that had just been caged. That awareness was correct. Dr. Ashford's voice had already begun making phone calls before the colonel's blood stopped dripping into the biohazard waste. His office. His personal line. The kind of calls that don't appear on official records. By the time Katie finished documenting her intervention, clinical, precise, 5 sentences describing the MRE chest seal and the reasoning behind every decision, the machinery of institutional power was already grinding toward her. She could feel it in the way Dr. Morrison avoided her eyes in the hallway. In the way the trauma surgeon, arriving 23 minutes too late to save the colonel's life, looked at the improvised seal with an expression that mixed professional respect with something darker, concern about precedent, about a nurse operating outside the hierarchy. The next morning, a formal memo appeared on the unit board. Not congratulations. Not recognition. An investigation notification. Dr. Ashford had filed an official complaint with the nursing director, unauthorized deviation from established protocol. Performance of procedures outside the scope of practice. Dangerous improvisation that could have resulted in patient harm. The colonel had survived. His vitals had stabilized. His O2 sat was climbing steadily. None of that mattered. What mattered was that Katie had stepped outside the cage, and the cage demanded accountability. By Tuesday afternoon, Katie's schedule had been dismantled. Her night shift was split between 2 units. Her support staff, the 2 nurses who'd actually listened to her, who'd stopped abandoning the break room when she sat down, were reassigned to trauma and ICU with explanations about the balancing caseloads. The staffing board showed Katie's name alone on most nights now, a message as clear as broken glass: work alone, or don't work at all. It wasn't a direct order. It was strategic. It was the application of institutional power disguised as administrative efficiency. Dr. Ashford moved like a man playing chess 3 moves ahead. Katie would later learn, much later, when the hospital's legal team finally pulled his email records, that he'd called the medical board chairman on Wednesday. Not officially. Not through channels. A personal call to a man who'd golfed with Ashford at River Oaks Country Club for the past 8 years. The conversation had been brief. Careful. I have concerns about a nurse who may be experiencing some form of hero complex. Trauma situations can trigger overconfidence in staff who lack the depth of experience necessary for sound judgment. Not an accusation. Just concern. Just the kind of thing a thoughtful physician might mention to a colleague. The kind of thing that plants seeds. By Thursday, Katie's name had been flagged in the medical board's internal system. Not suspended. Not formally investigated. Just flagged. A notation that would color every reference, every decision, every future opportunity in her career. The mechanism of institutional destruction is patient. It doesn't scream. It whispers. Katie's resolve began to fracture not from the isolation, not from the reassignments, but from the sudden absence of hope. She'd spent 3 years building a new identity, brick by brick, hiding the pieces of herself that didn't fit into the shape of a civilian nurse. For 3 years, no one had asked questions about the limp. No one had noticed the way her hands moved with the precision of someone trained to operate under fire. No one had suspected that the quiet, deferential woman in blue was Major Katie Rodriguez, Silver Star citation filed somewhere in Arlington, Purple Heart earned in the blood-soaked sand of Tikrit. She'd been invisible. She'd been safe. Now invisibility felt like erasure. The final blow came Friday morning. Katie arrived for her shift to find a meeting notice in her personnel file. She was to report to Human Resources at 0800 hours. Not a request. Not a suggestion. The language was administrative, but the subtext was execution. The woman conducting the termination was named Patricia Walsh, and she had the practiced sympathy of someone who'd done this before. Katie, I want to be clear, this isn't a reflection on your nursing skills. The medical board has expressed concerns. Dr. Ashford's documentation of the incident shows clear protocol deviation. Hospital policy requires us to place you on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Her hands were folded on the desk. Her voice was soft as anesthesia. We're going to need your badge and your credentials. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. The box they gave her was cardboard, the kind that smells like machine oil and disappointment. Katie packed the cracked mug from her locker, a gift from her last unit, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, and the photograph of her medic, Sanchez, the one who didn't make it out of Tikrit. She added the dying succulent, the small green plant that had somehow managed to cling to life despite her neglect, and carried it all out through the staff entrance where the day's shift was arriving. She could feel their eyes. Could feel the narrative already forming in their minds. The nurse who'd gotten too ambitious. Who'd stepped outside her place. Who'd been caught. Security walked beside her, not roughly, just present. The message was clear enough. She was no longer part of this institution. She was a liability that had been successfully contained. That night, Katie sat at a bus stop 3 blocks away, rain hammering against the shelter like artillery. The cardboard box was on her lap, growing soft with moisture. The photograph of Sanchez stared up at her, his face frozen in that moment before the IED detonated. 18 years old. From a small town in New Mexico. Dead because Katie was 3 seconds too slow getting the tourniquet on his thigh. She'd been hiding from that moment, from that weight, from the knowledge that she carried someone's death inside her chest cavity like shrapnel that would never fully heal. And hiding had cost her this too. She pressed the unit patch against her heart through the thin fabric of her scrubs. The patch was barely visible, just thread and faded fabric, a secret that had protected her and destroyed her in equal measure. She wondered if she'd made a mistake, all those years ago, choosing invisibility over recognition. Choosing the scrubs over the uniform. Choosing to survive instead of fighting. The bus was 15 minutes late. Katie didn't mind. She was getting good at waiting. But at 2,300 hours, 3 hours after security had escorted her from the building, her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She'd learned to ignore things, to make herself small. But some part of her, the part that wore rank insignia before she wore a stethoscope, answered. Major Rodriguez. The voice on the other end was military precise. Subordinate's formality addressing a superior. This is Colonel James Holloway, 1st Special Operations Command. We need you back at Seattle General. Now. The rain didn't stop. The fluorescent lights at the bus stop didn't dim. But something shifted in Katie's chest, a sensation like the first time you step off a helicopter onto hostile terrain, the recognition that the world had just tilted, and there was no going back to the way things were. 15 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. No insignia, no marking, just an institutional vehicle driven by a woman in a dark suit whose eyes suggested she'd cleared rooms before. Katie climbed in, cardboard box still on her lap, and watched Houston's night street slide past as the SUV turned toward Seattle General's emergency entrance. 3 black vehicles arrived at the main entrance in convoy formation. Not subtle. Not attempting to hide. The kind of arrival that makes hospital administration sit up straighter. The kind of arrival that changes the direction of institutional power with the bluntness of a sledgehammer. Katie was escorted directly to the ICU. The colonel's room. He was awake. His eyes tracked her the moment she entered, not the polite attention of a recovering patient, but the focused recognition of a soldier assessing a threat or an ally. His right hand moved, slow and careful, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But the single word he chose shattered everything. Viper. The room went silent. The kind of silence that happens when the architecture of a lie finally collapses. Her call sign. The designation she'd carried through 3 tours for IED attacks and 247 combat missions. The name that only her unit knew. The name that had no business existing outside of classified briefings and memories of sand and blood and the sound of a Black Hawk's rotor wash. His daughter was there, standing by the monitor, and her eyes went wide as she looked from her father to Katie to her father again. "You're Major Rodriguez," she said. Not a question. A recognition. A statement of fact delivered with the tone of someone who'd heard stories her entire life and was only now understanding they were true. Katie didn't speak. Speaking would mean admitting something. Speaking would mean the end of invisibility. But the colonel's hand reached out, trembling slightly, and his fingers found her wrist with the grip of someone who'd held life in his hands more times than he wanted to remember. The door opened. Hospital Administrator Patricia Walsh. Behind her, the medical board chairman. Behind him, 2 figures in dress uniforms, navy blue with the insignia of something Katie recognized as JSOC. The chairman pulled out his tablet and without preamble, began to read, Silver Star. Combat Medevac, Sanjin Valley, Helm and Province, 2011. He paused, met her eyes. Bronze Star, multiple accounts. Another pause. A deeper breath. 2 purple hearts. Combat Medical Badge. And citation paperwork for a Navy Cross recommendation that was apparently misfiled in 2013. Each decoration fell like a gavel strike. Each one a hammer blow against the narrative Dr. Ashford had so carefully constructed. The JSOC officer stepped forward, Holloway, and his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We reviewed your investigation file, Ms. Walsh. We also reviewed the hospital's security footage from the evening of the colonel's admission." He gestured, and someone appeared with a laptop. Dr. Ashford, ordering staff to stand down while the patient went into decompensation. Dr. Ashford, blocking nursing interventions. Dr. Ashford, giving explicit instructions to delay care. Patricia Walsh's face had gone the color of old milk. We weren't aware." "You're aware now," Holloway said. "Legal is already in touch with your risk management team. We'll also be reviewing the past 18 months of Dr. Ashford's case files. My preliminary conversation with hospital legal suggests your institution may have some significant liability regarding delayed interventions and pattern of negligence. Suggest you speak with your attorney." The room didn't just go quiet. It compressed, like the air pressure changing before a storm. But Katie wasn't looking at the administrators. She was looking at the colonel, whose hand still gripped her wrist, and at his daughter, whose eyes had filled with tears because somewhere in the clinical description of military honor, she'd finally understood what her father had been trying to tell her about who this woman was. The closing doors. The descent into institutional justice that moves slower but far more comprehensively than any single person's anger. By Monday, Dr. Ashford's hospital privileges were suspended. By Wednesday, his legal counsel was advising him that resignation was preferable to termination. By Friday, he was clearing his office in the pre-dawn hours, no security escort, no ceremony, just a man carrying a cardboard box to a Mercedes sedan while the city slept. 6 months later, Katie stood at a podium in the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, wearing dress blues that still fit because some uniforms never really come off. The Surgeon General's medallion hung around her neck, bronze and ribbon and recognition for the integration of combat medical protocols into civilian trauma care. The colonel sat in the front row, his daughter beside him, both standing to applaud. Nurses Chen and Patel from Seattle General's night shift had flown in from Houston, clapping until their hands hurt. Katie's acceptance speech was brief. "I spent 3 years hiding who I was, thinking I had to choose between my past and my future. I learned that the best parts of us don't disappear when we take off the uniform. They just wait for the moment when someone needs them." She returned to Seattle General as Director of Trauma Nursing. Within a year, her implementation of combat-tested protocols reduced ER mortality by 18%. The dying succulent on her desk was thriving now, new growth on every stem. The photograph of Sanchez sat beside it, no longer a wound but a memorial. And the faded green beret unit patch remained sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed against her heart, exactly where it had always been. Dr. Ashford was selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table at a strip mall off Highway 59. His designer watch was gone, replaced by a Timex. Customers avoided eye contact. It was the same dynamic he'd once used against Katie: invisibility, isolation, the systematic application of institutional power. But this time, the cage was made of consequence, and there was no one inside willing to help him escape it. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've ever felt underestimated by someone who didn't know your history, please hit subscribe. And comment below, what would you do if you discovered the person you dismissed was actually the person who'd save your life?